The Nile drifted through the heart of the desert, a ribbon of water in a world of sand and silence. Its steady current carried life, season after season, bringing with it the silt that nourished fields, the coolness that sustained villages, the rhythm that defined time itself. Along its banks rose the civilization of Egypt, a people who measured their days not only by the rise and fall of the river, but by a deeper current, the passage between life and death. To them, the line was not an ending, it was a continuation, a journey and a mystery that filled their thoughts and shaped their monuments. The pharaohs, rulers of this ancient land, understood this mystery in ways that were both practical and profound. They governed not only as kings upon the earth, but as beings who prepared ceaselessly for the transition into eternity. Their lives were framed by the belief that death was not a silence, but a passage into another realm, a realm that reflected life in new and eternal ways. Every action they took, every stone they ordered placed, every ritual they sanctioned, was woven with the awareness of this unseen world. Imagine the stillness of an Egyptian morning. The sun rose slowly over the desert, spilling gold across the horizon. The temples stood silent, their pillars casting long shadows across the sand. Priests moved quietly within, their voices low, their chants steady, their incense curling in thin trails that scented the air. The people of Egypt awoke with the same rhythm, knowing that beyond their tasks of farming, of trade, of crafting, lay the ever-present truth. Life was temporary, and death was not to be feared but understood, embraced, and prepared for. The pharaohs carried this truth more deeply than any. For them, death was not an end to their reign. It was a continuation of it, in another form, in another place, in a realm that mirrored the Nile's eternal flow. The tombs they built were not mere resting places, but vast doorways into eternity. The pyramids rose against the desert sky, not only as monuments of stone, but as spiritual machines carefully aligned, deliberately shaped, designed to carry the soul of the ruler into the afterlife. Each block, each chamber, each passage was placed with intention, with meaning, with the knowledge that the pharaoh's journey after death was as vital as his reign in life. The people believed that when a pharaoh died, he did not vanish, he crossed into the presence of the gods, joining with Ra, the sun god, traveling across the heavens, descending into the underworld, rising again each dawn. His death was not a fall into darkness, but an elevation, a transformation, and yet this transformation required preparation. The pharaoh knew that to cross into eternity, he must be equipped with all the tools of life and all the rituals of passage. Thus, their tombs were filled with treasures, with food, with clothing, with amulets and scrolls, all to guide and sustain the soul in the unseen journey. In the still chambers of the pyramids, one can imagine the flicker of torchlight against smooth limestone walls. Hieroglyphs carved with patience and skill covered every surface, their colors still vivid, their shapes telling stories not only of kingship and conquest, but of the path the soul must take after death. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and guidance, was inscribed upon papyrus and stone, serving as a map for the pharaoh's spirit. Each word was chosen carefully, each line carrying the weight of belief. To the Egyptians, words were not only sounds, they were power, they were essence, they were life itself. By writing them, by speaking them, they ensured that the journey of the soul would be secure. Outside, the desert stretched wide and endless. Sand shifted in slow waves, carrying with it the heat of the day and the coolness of the night. Stars, filled the sky in patterns that the Egyptians studied with devotion, for to them the heavens were not distant. They were the reflection of eternity. The stars themselves were the souls of the departed, shining in their eternal journey, guiding the living with their quiet light. The Pharaoh knew that his soul would one day join them, shining forever in the night, watching over the land he once ruled. The rituals of death were woven into daily life. The people saw in every sunrise a reflection of resurrection, for the sun itself was Ra's journey, disappearing into the underworld each night, only to rise again with power and light. Death, then, was not final. It was part of a cycle as natural as the Nile's flood, as steady as the stars. The Pharaoh, standing between the people and the gods, was the living proof of this belief. His life, his death, his afterlife, all were part of the same rhythm. Within the temples, priests chanted softly, their voices low, steady, like the beating of the heart. They prepared offerings for the gods, pouring milk, placing bread, lighting incense, all as part of the sacred order. Each act was a reminder that life and death were bound together, that the gods watched over both. The Pharaoh himself participated, offering gifts, leading rituals, affirming to his people that death was not to be dreaded, but to be embraced with reverence. The process of preparing the body for death was itself a sacred act. Mummification was not merely preservation, but transformation. The body was washed, anointed with oils, wrapped in linen, each layer accompanied by words of power, by prayers that bound the soul to eternity. Amulets were placed carefully, each with its own meaning, its own protection. The scarab beetle, symbol of rebirth, was placed upon the chest, ensuring that the heart would be strong in the afterlife. The eyes were painted, the lips sealed with care, as though the body were not simply being preserved, but being prepared for a new life. When the Pharaoh's body was laid within the sarcophagus, it was not a burial, it was a passage. The heavy stone lid was closed, sealing within it not silence, but transition. Outside, priests continued their chants, their incense burning, their prayers rising like smoke to the heavens. The tomb was filled with treasures, with gold, with statues, with everyday tools and ornaments, for the Pharaoh would need them all. The journey into the afterlife was not empty. It was full, rich, as real as life itself. And so, in the desert, these great tombs stood, silent yet alive with meaning. The pyramids rose, their points aligned with the stars, their sides mirroring the rays of the sun. They were not only monuments of stone, they were stairways into eternity, guiding the soul of the Pharaoh upward, outward, into the infinite. The people, too, shared in this vision of death. Though their tombs were smaller, their rituals less grand, they held the same beliefs. They buried their dead with care, with amulets, with small treasures, with food for the journey. They spoke the same prayers, sang the same chants, looked to the same stars. In Egypt, death was not a boundary between kings and peasants. It was the common truth, the shared journey, the passage all must take. The Pharaoh's grandeur only reflected more brightly the belief held by every farmer, every craftsman, every mother and child. The Nile continued its flow, season after season, just as life continued, just as death continued. Crops grew, villages thrived, children were born, elders passed away, and through it all, the understanding of death as a passage, not an end, gave the people peace. They did not fear the desert silence, for they saw it mirrored in the silence of the tomb, a silence that was not emptiness, but fullness, waiting. Transition. In the cool evening, as the stars brightened over the desert, one can imagine the Pharaoh standing upon the steps of his temple, gazing upward. He knew, as his people knew, that his life was a chapter, his death a doorway, his afterlife a continuation. The gods had shown them that nothing ended, only changed. And so, he ruled not for himself alone, but for eternity, knowing that when he passed, he would continue, guiding his people from the realm beyond, shining among the stars, rising with the sun, sailing with Ra across the heavens. Death to the Pharaoh was not darkness. It was light, it was renewal, it was the assurance that nothing truly ceased. His body might rest within the tomb, but his spirit would live on, forever woven into the rhythms of the earth. The Nile, the sky, the stars, and so Egypt lived, and so Egypt endured, guided by rulers who knew that to understand death was to understand life itself, that the passage into eternity was not an ending, but the greatest of journeys. The desert night was vast and endless, and the people of Egypt lived beneath its canopy of stars with a sense of quiet reverence. The sky was not empty to them. It was alive, filled with signs, messages, and pathways. The Pharaoh, whose life was bound to the rhythm of heaven, looked upon the stars and saw in them the promise of eternal return. To gaze upward was to see eternity unfolding, not as a mystery to be feared, but as a realm to which all would travel. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light, and the Egyptians called it the celestial reflection of the Nile. Just as the Nile nourished their land, so too did this cosmic river carry the souls of the departed to their eternal home. The Pharaoh believed his journey would follow this shining path. His spirit would sail upon the solar boat of Ra, crossing through the night sky, facing trials, and yet always rising again with the dawn. In the stillness of the tomb chambers, these beliefs were carved in patient detail. Scenes showed the Pharaoh standing before Osiris, the lord of the underworld, offering words of truth. His heart weighed against the feather of Mat, the symbol of order, balance, and justice. This weighing of the heart was central to their vision of death. The heart, seat of memory and conscience, was not measured for wealth or power, but for truth. If the heart was light, balanced with the feather, the soul was granted passage into eternity. If heavy, burdened with falsehood, it was devoured by Ammit, the fearsome guardian of judgment. Yet even this fearsome presence was not cruel, but simply part of the balance. For the Egyptians, balance was everything in life, in rule, in death. The pharaohs prepared for this moment with great care. Their lives were shaped not only by earthly power, but by the responsibility to uphold Mat. Each law they decreed, each temple they built, each ritual they performed was part of this sacred duty. To fail in life would mean to fail in death. And so, their reign was not only political, but deeply spiritual. The people believed that through the pharaoh's justice, the order of the universe itself was upheld. His role was not limited to the throne. It extended into the unseen realms, where his soul would one day stand before Osiris and prove that he had lived in harmony with the divine order. The temples of Egypt stood as bridges between the mortal world and the eternal. Vast courtyards opened into cool inner halls, their walls lined with carvings of gods and kings, their ceilings painted with stars. As one walked deeper within, the outside world fell away, replaced by an atmosphere of reverence and timelessness. Priests whispered their chants, carrying words that echoed with centuries of tradition. Torches flickered, casting shadows that seemed to bring the carvings to life. In those spaces, one could sense the merging of life and death, of earth and sky, of the present and the eternal. The Pharaoh, seated upon his throne, was seen not merely as a man, but as Horus incarnate, the living god who bridged heaven and earth at death. He became Osiris, ruler of the underworld, ensuring that the cycle of kingship and rebirth continued. This transformation was not symbolic alone. It was real, as real to the Egyptians as the rising of the sun. The Pharaoh did not die as a man, but as a god. His journey was one of transformation, ascension, and eternal guardianship. Consider the construction of a tomb, perhaps in the Valley of the Kings, where cliffs of golden limestone held within them, chambers cut deep into the earth, workers carved with steady rhythm, their tools striking stone with patience. Artists followed, painting walls with scenes of the afterlife, the Pharaoh sailing upon the solar bark, facing serpents, passing gates guarded by strange beings, finally reaching the field of reeds, the paradise where souls lived in eternal peace, farming fertile fields, surrounded by loved ones, embraced by the gods. Each figure painted, each spell inscribed, was not mere decoration. It was a preparation, a living part of the Pharaoh's eternal passage. The Egyptians believed that the afterlife mirrored life, but perfected. The field of reeds was their vision of paradise, endless fertile land, cool waters, gentle breezes, and the company of family and friends. To reach it, however, the soul had to endure the trials of the underworld. The Pharaoh, equipped with spells, amulets, and offerings, was guided step by step. Every door, every guardian, every challenge was met with knowledge written upon the tomb walls and papyrus scrolls, knowledge preserved with care so that the soul would never be lost. The people who lived in villages along the Nile shared in this belief, though on a simpler scale. They too buried their loved ones with amulets, with food, with small treasures to ease the journey. They too whispered prayers, called upon the gods, and trusted in the eternal cycle. Death was not spoken of with dread, but with reverence, as a passage all must take, a passage no less sacred for the humble than for the mighty. As the wind stirred across the desert, carrying with it the scent of sand and stone, the monuments stood as silent witnesses to these beliefs. The great pyramids, rising against the horizon, caught the light of the sun, their sides gleaming as though they themselves were alive with purpose. To stand before them was to feel the weight of eternity, not in fear, but in awe. The Pharaohs had ordered them built not only for grandeur, but for connection. The alignment of their sides to the cardinal directions, the precision of their shape, the chambers hidden within all of it served the deeper truth, to guide the soul beyond death, to secure its place among the stars, in the quiet hours of night when the desert cooled and the stars shone brightly overhead. One might imagine a priest standing at the entrance of a tomb, lifting his hands in prayer. His words carried softly into the air, calling upon Anubis, guardian of the dead, to guide the Pharaoh's soul. He spoke of Isis, the devoted mother, who gathered the pieces of Osiris and gave him new life. He invoked Thoth, the scribe of the gods, who recorded every truth and judgment. Each god played a role, each god offered protection, and together they formed a pantheon that surrounded the Pharaoh with guidance. As tender as it was powerful, the Pharaoh's journey through death was not solitary. He was accompanied by these divine presences, by the prayers of his people, by the treasures placed in his tomb. The Egyptians saw eternity not as a lonely void, but as a realm filled with company, order, and beauty. Their vision of death was interwoven with love, love of the gods, love of family, love of the land itself, and always at the center of it was the Nile. Its flood, its retreat, its unceasing flow mirrored the passage of life into death and back again. The pharaoh ruled with this rhythm in his heart, knowing that just as the river returned each year to bring life to the fields, so too would the soul return, renewed, reborn, eternal. The hush of the desert stretched endlessly, and in that stillness, the monuments of Egypt seemed to breathe with memory. Stone carried the weight of centuries, yet it also carried silence, a silence filled with meaning. Within the great tombs, the pharaohs rested, their spirits sailing far beyond, while their legacy remained carved into every wall, painted in every chamber, whispered in every prayer. The journey of the pharaoh after death was not an isolated tale. It was a reflection of the entire world the Egyptians believed in. A world where every sunrise, every flood, every cycle of nature spoke of eternal renewal. To live was to prepare, gently and steadily, for the passage that would one day come. To rule, as the pharaoh did, was to bear the responsibility of preparing not only oneself, but also guiding the people toward an understanding of the balance between life and death. The Egyptians saw death as a mirror of life. In their vision of the field of reeds, they imagined a land of green abundance, cool waters flowing between endless fields, where families gathered once more, where farmers tilled the soil without hardship, where the seasons were always gentle. To the pharaoh, this was not a distant dream. It was a reality waiting beyond the veil, a reality as ordered and harmonious as the world he had ruled in life. His task, therefore, was to ensure that harmony extended across both realms, that his life reflected the truth required to enter eternity. The ceremonies that marked a pharaoh's passing were carefully ordered, filled with ritual significance. Priests moved with slow precision, their chants measured and calm, their offerings placed in careful sequence. They opened the mouth of the statue or mummy, a sacred act that restored the senses to the deceased, the ability to breathe, to eat, to see, to speak, so that in the afterlife nothing would be lacking. Incense filled the air with fragrance, and the sound of sistrums and drums echoed gently. Never harsh, always steady, like the heartbeat of eternity. The body, prepared through mummification, was not seen as mere remains. It was the vessel through which the soul would recognize itself. Without preservation, the soul might be lost. And so the embalmers worked with reverence, layer upon layer of linen, prayer upon prayer, binding the pharaoh to eternity. Each amulet tucked within the wrappings was chosen with care, the eye of Horus for protection, the scarab for rebirth, the ankh for life everlasting. These were not trinkets. They were bridges between worlds. Deep within the tomb, the sarcophagus, weighted, carved with symbols of guardianship, painted with images of deities stretching their arms in welcome. When the pharaoh was placed within, it was not the closing of a life, but the opening of a passage. Heavy stones sealed the chamber, yet the Egyptians believed that through the inscriptions, the soul would move freely, following the guidance etched into every surface. The tomb became a map, a vessel, a doorway. Outside, the desert wind carried grains of sand across the land. The people continued their daily lives, farmers tending to fields by the Nile, children laughing in villages, artisans carving statues in workshops. Yet in all these acts, there was the awareness that death was part of life, as natural as the rising of the sun. They saw the pharaoh's grand journey as an echo of their own, on a smaller scale, yet no less sacred. For just as the king faced the weighing of the heart, so too would the humblest worker stand before Osiris. Their life measured by truth, by balance, by Mat. The belief in Mat, balance and order, was central to all of Egyptian thought. Without balance, the world would fall into chaos. The Nile might fail to flood, crops might wither, the sun might not rise. To live in harmony with Mat was to ensure that life and death both flowed as they should. The pharaoh embodied this principle. His role was to preserve balance in the kingdom, just as he sought balance in his own soul. In doing so, he guaranteed not only earthly prosperity, but also the smooth passage of his spirit into eternity. The myths of Osiris, Isis, and Horus formed the foundation of this understanding. Osiris, the god who was slain and resurrected, was the eternal example of rebirth. His wife, Isis, with devotion and love, restored him, piecing together his body, breathing life back into him. Their son, Horus, avenged his father and took his place, continuing the cycle. The pharaoh, in life, was Horus, the living king. In death, he became Osiris, the ruler of the underworld. His son or successor then became Horus, ensuring that the cycle was never broken. Through these myths, the Egyptians saw not just gods, but patterns of life and death repeated endlessly, assuring them that no death was final. The stars above reflected this same cycle. Orion, which they associated with Osiris, rose and set, disappearing into the night, only to return again. Sirius, the bright star linked with Isis, heralded the flooding of the Nile each year, bringing renewal. To look upon the heavens was to see the eternal drama played out, disappearance, struggle, and return, again and again. The pharaoh, in his death, was assured that he too would follow this cosmic rhythm, rising among the stars, shining forever, walking through the temples. One would see carvings of the pharaoh offering to the gods, standing tall yet humble, extending gifts of food, drink, incense, and gold. These were not mere displays of wealth. They were acts of alignment with Mat, affirmations that the pharaoh honored the divine order. By doing so, he secured not only his reign but also his eternal passage. The offerings given in life echoed in the offerings placed in death. The tomb filled with abundance, prepared for the journey beyond. The people, too, found comfort in these acts. Watching the pharaoh's rituals reminded them that the same gods watched over their own lives and deaths. When they buried their loved ones, they did so with smaller offerings, smaller prayers, yet carried the same faith. Death was never far from thought, but it was never feared as an enemy. It was a step, solemn yet gentle, awaited with reverence. In the soft light of dusk, the Nile shimmered, its waters reflecting the fading sun. Boats drifted across its surface, sails catching the breeze. Fishermen cast their nets, families gathered along the banks. In that golden hour, the Egyptians felt the nearness of the eternal, for the setting sun was not an end, but a reminder of the cycle. Soon it would travel through the underworld, face its trials, and return at dawn. The pharaoh, too, would follow this path, disappearing into the tomb yet rising again, his soul sailing with the gods. Within the tomb, the inscriptions told of trials to come. Serpents guarded gates, lakes of fire lay ahead, strange beings questioned the soul. Yet with every challenge, the pharaoh was given words of power, spells to guide him safely. His heart, if pure, would carry him through. The Egyptians did not imagine the afterlife as effortless, but they trusted that preparation and truth would bring victory. The Pharaoh's tomb, filled with these guides, became both shield and compass, leading him toward eternal peace. The stillness of these beliefs carried into every corner of Egyptian life. Children were taught from a young age that to live truthfully was to prepare the heart for weighing. Farmers prayed as they sowed their crops. Craftsmen carved amulets with prayers in their minds. Mothers whispered blessings over their children. All of it was part of the rhythm of life, flowing seamlessly into the rhythm of death. And so, as the desert stars brightened above, the Pharaoh's people lay down to rest, knowing that their lives were embraced by eternity, that death was not an end but a return. They trusted that their Pharaoh, in death, would guide them still, shining as a star, sailing with Ra, protecting them across the ages. The silence of the desert was deep, and within that silence the Egyptians found meaning. To them, stillness was not empty. It was filled with presence, with a quiet assurance that the gods watched, that the river would return, that the sun would rise. Death, like the desert night, was vast, silent, and full of unseen life. The Pharaohs knew this, and so they lived with an awareness that their reign was but one part of an eternal story. The preparation for death began long before a Pharaoh's final breath. From the moment of coronation, he was not only king in life, but destined as a traveler in death. His tomb began to take shape soon after he wore the crown, carved slowly over years, planned with precision, hidden within the earth, or rising boldly as a pyramid against the sky. Each chamber, each passage, was drawn not only by architects, but by priests, who ensured that the path mirrored the journey the soul would take. The Pharaoh's tomb was his greatest work, not for the living world, but for the eternal. Stone by stone, workers built in the heat of the sun. They pulled massive blocks with ropes, rolled them on logs, lifted them with ramps, their chants keeping rhythm with their labor. Artists followed, their brushes and chisels turning blank walls into scenes of eternity. Blue and gold shone in. The flickering torchlight, hieroglyphs spiraled across plaster, and the figures of gods stretched tall upon the walls. The Pharaoh's journey was being mapped, not upon papyrus alone, but upon the very stone that would guard his body forever. Within these walls, the story unfolded. The Pharaoh stood before Osiris, his arms lifted in offering. Anubis weighed his heart, the scales balanced with the feather of Mat. Thoth stood nearby, recording every detail with calm precision. Beyond them stretched the landscapes of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, a realm not of punishment, but of transformation. Rivers of fire glowed, serpents coiled, gates rose high. But at the end of this journey was light, renewal, and eternal peace. The Pharaoh's tomb became the stage for this journey, ensuring that his soul would never be lost, never wander without guidance. The rituals that surrounded death were careful and slow. Priests wrapped the body with patience, layer upon layer, linen upon linen, each strip tied with a blessing. The scent of oils and resins filled the chamber, rich and sweet, preserving not only the body but the sacred essence of life itself. The Pharaoh's face was covered with a mask of gold, its calm features reflecting the eternal calm of death. Eyes of inlaid stone gazed upward, not with sorrow, but with serenity, as though already seeing the stars beyond the tomb. The procession to the tomb was solemn, yet not sorrowful. Musicians played soft tones, mourners raised their voices in ritual. Laments, priests carried incense that curled into the air. The people watched, knowing that their king was not leaving them but entering a greater realm. They believed he would become Osiris, lord of the afterlife, and from there he would continue to guide them, his presence woven into the cycles of the land. Once the body was placed within the sarcophagus, and the treasures arranged around it, the final prayers were spoken. Spells were read aloud to awaken the senses of the pharaoh, to guide his steps, to protect him from dangers on the journey ahead. Then the tomb was sealed, stone pressed against stone, silence falling once more. Yet in that silence, life continued. The pharaoh's body rested, but his spirit began its passage, carried upon the solar boat of Ra, descending into the night, ready to rise again with the dawn. Outside, the Nile flowed gently, as it always had. Farmers planted in fields watered. By its flood, fishermen cast their nets, children played on its banks. The life of Egypt continued, just as death continued, one feeding into the other. The people saw no boundary between the two. The pharaoh's death was not a rupture, but a continuation, as natural as the rivers flood and retreat. The gods themselves reflected this understanding. Ra, the sun, vanished each evening into the underworld, only to return each morning renewed. Osiris, slain, was restored by Isis, proving that death was but a transition. Even the stars disappeared with the dawn and returned with the night, showing the people that all things moved in cycles. To fear death would be to deny the rhythm of the universe. To embrace it, to prepare for it, was to live in harmony with the divine. The pharaoh carried this truth most deeply. His reign was measured not only in victories or laws, but in the balance he preserved. Each temple he raised, each offering he gave, each word he spoke in honor of the gods, was part of his preparation. He knew that when his heart was weighed, these acts would tip the balance toward truth. He ruled not only for the present, but for eternity in the field of reeds. Where the pharaoh hoped to dwell after judgment, eternity was gentle and familiar. Families gathered, crops grew tall, cattle grazed, and water flowed clear and cool. The air was soft, the light golden, the seasons eternal. For the Egyptians, paradise was not strange or alien. It was a perfected reflection of life along the Nile, free from pain, free from hunger, free from sorrow. Too long for this place was too long for a return to harmony. To prepare for death was to prepare for home. Each amulet, each carving, each prayer woven into the pharaoh's burial was a step toward this eternal home. The scarab, symbol of rebirth, reminded the soul that just as the beetle rolled its ball of life-giving earth, so too would the soul roll forward into new beginnings. The eye of Horus watched with protective strength. The Ankh whispered of unending life. Together they formed a shield, a language of eternity written not in words alone but in symbols, powerful and lasting. Even the positioning of the body, the direction of the tomb, the alignment of the pyramid were all chosen with care. The pharaoh was placed facing the stars, aligned with constellations, connected to the heavens above. The architecture itself was a prayer, a guiding hand, a way of saying that life was woven into the cosmos, never lost, always part of the greater design. The people carried these truths in their own quiet ways. They laid simple amulets upon their dead, placed food in humble tombs, whispered prayers as they buried loved ones. They looked to the pharaoh's grand tombs and felt assurance, knowing that if their king's soul would rise, so too would their own eternity was not for the few. It was for all, though the pharaoh's passage blazed brightly, showing the way. The night deepened, the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and the desert lay in silence once more. Yet to the Egyptians, that silence was alive with meaning. Every star was a soul shining in eternity. Every gust of wind a reminder of unseen presence. The Pharaoh, though gone from their sight, was with them still, in the rising sun, in the flowing river, in the stars that gleamed eternal above. The desert winds whispered across the timeless sands, and in those whispers the Egyptians felt the voices of eternity. The Pharaohs, wrapped in silence, knew that these winds had passed across the land for thousands of years before them and would continue to do so long after. Death, to them, was as steady and enduring as the wind, unseen yet always present, never ceasing, never cruel, only guiding life toward the eternal horizon. The ancient priests spoke of the Ka and the Ba, two essences of the self, two threads of existence that wove together into life and continued beyond death. The Ka was the life force, the breath that sustained, the energy that lingered even when the body grew still. The Ba was the personality, the freedom of movement, the bird-like essence that could leave the tomb, travel, and return. At death, these two parts did not vanish. They shifted, transformed, sought reunion. Through ritual and prayer, the Pharaoh ensured that his Ka and Ba would find their harmony once more, uniting into the Ok, the shining one, the radiant spirit that lived forever. This understanding softened the mystery of death. The Pharaohs believed that their essence was not extinguished but lifted, purified, prepared for a higher form of being. As the priests performed their careful rites, the soul was strengthened, guided, sheltered from harm. The Book of the Dead, inscribed upon papyrus and stone, was more than text. It was a compass for the eternal traveler, a voice that whispered directions in the silence of the beyond. Each spell, each line, was a gentle hand leading the Pharaoh through the gates of night toward the dawn of immortality. The images upon tomb walls glowed softly in torchlight. They told stories not of despair but of hope. The Pharaoh sailed upon the solar boat with Ra drifting across the celestial waters, passing through realms of fire and shadow, yet always moving forward, always approaching light. Around him the gods stood watchful, their forms tall and calm, their hands outstretched in blessing. Even the serpents and guardians of the Duat were not terrors but tests, symbols of obstacles that could be overcome with wisdom, courage, and truth. The Pharaoh, armed with spells, with amulets, with the purity of his heart, could pass unharmed. To live in ancient Egypt was to live with the certainty of this journey. Children grew hearing the stories. Farmers looked to the stars and remembered the paths of the souls. Artisans carved symbols that reminded them of the eternity beyond sight. Death was not hidden. It was spoken of gently, woven into festivals, rituals, songs. The people knew that the Pharaoh's grandeur reflected their own destinies in smaller forms. His pyramids rose like mountains, but even in a simple tomb of clay, the same truths were honored. The Ka, the Ba, the Ok, they belonged to every person, not just to kings. The cycles of nature reflected these beliefs. When the Nile flooded, fields were reborn. When it receded, seeds were sown, and crops rose again. To the Egyptians, the river's rhythm was a mirror of life and death. The Pharaoh, who ruled as the divine shepherd of the land, embodied this cycle most fully. His death was a flood, his burial a retreat, his rebirth the harvest of eternity. As surely as the Nile returned, so too would the Pharaoh rise from his tomb, renewed and eternal, in the cool, shadowed halls of temples. Priests chanted hymns that echoed softly against stone. The air was heavy with incense, the scent sweet and steady, Statues of gods loomed in the half-light, their faces serene, their eyes gazing beyond the mortal world. Here, in sacred silence, the pharaoh's name was spoken, his essence invoked, his presence kept alive. For the Egyptians knew that memory itself was a form of survival. To speak the name of the dead was to keep their soul nourished. The pharaoh's names, carved deeply in stone, painted upon walls, preserved in countless prayers, ensured that he would never fade into nothingness. Even the stars carried memory. The Egyptians looked upward at night and saw not only points of light, but the souls of the departed. They called them imperishable stars, never setting, never fading, circling forever above the horizon. Pharaohs longed to join these stars, to shine eternally in the night sky, watching over their people, guiding them with light. In the alignment of pyramids, in the shafts that pointed toward constellations, one sees this longing made stone, death. Lifted the pharaoh from earth to sky, from body to star, from silence to radiance. The rituals of daily life were not separate from death. When bread was baked, when wine was poured, when incense was lit, the people remembered that these same offerings would one day nourish their loved ones in the afterlife. The pharaoh, surrounded by endless abundance in his tomb, was not indulging in excess, but preparing to sustain his food, drink, clothing, furniture, even boats were placed with him, not as treasures of pride, but as necessities for life eternal. In death, life continued. And so the pharaoh's tomb was filled with all that he would require. The craftsmen who made these objects worked with devotion. A chair carved from ebony, a cup inlaid with gold, a necklace strung with lapis and carnelian. Each was shaped not only with skill, but with prayer. The artist knew that his work would rest beside the pharaoh forever, crossing the threshold into eternity. To create for the dead was to create for the gods, and so each line, each color, was chosen with reverence. In this way, art became a bridge, carrying beauty from the mortal world into the timeless one. The people believed that the pharaoh's journey helped sustain their own. As he traveled through the Duat and joined with the sun, he ensured that the world would continue, that the Nile would flow, that the crops would rise. His death was not an end, but a renewal of the covenant between gods and men. To mourn him was to honor him, but to despair was unnecessary, for his spirit remained, luminous and eternal. Night after night, the Egyptians looked upon the horizon and saw the sun sink, knowing it would rise again. They looked upon the pharaoh's tomb and felt the same assurance. Just as Ra could not be defeated by the darkness, so too the pharaoh could not be undone by death. His presence endured, his soul moved forward, his name echoed in stone and sky, and in this the people found peace. Their lives, though brief, were part of a greater pattern. Their deaths, though sorrowful, were passages toward a gentle eternity. The pharaoh's knowledge of death was shared with all, that death was not to be feared, but embraced as the next step in an endless journey, a return to harmony, a union with the eternal. The hush of the desert at night carried with it a sense of endlessness, a stillness that the pharaohs cherished and contemplated. They understood that silence was not the absence of life, but the presence of eternity. Within that stillness, the cycles of creation, life, death, and rebirth unfolded quietly, without urgency, without end. Death, in this way, was not a rupture, but another pause in the music of existence. A silence before the next note. The Egyptians gazed upon the horizon and saw a story written in light and shadow. Each morning the sun rose, bright and certain. gliding upward across the sky. Each evening it descended, sinking into the unseen, carried into the west where the hidden realms began. To them, this daily rhythm mirrored the Pharaoh's passage. Just as Ra entered the Duat at dusk, to battle, to journey, and to return at dawn, so too would the Pharaoh pass into darkness and emerge renewed. This knowledge did not bring fear, but reassurance. Within temples, the sacred texts whispered of gates and guardians, of challenges faced in the night. These were not meant to terrify, but to prepare. They reminded the Pharaoh that death was a journey requiring readiness. To be truthful, to be balanced, to be guided by Mat, the principle of harmony was to carry the strongest shield. The rituals of life, offering prayer, justice, order, were not empty acts. They were the Pharaoh's provisions for the great passage. Each day of righteous rule became a step laid upon the path beyond death. The pyramids, rising with monumental calm, were themselves hymns to eternity. Their sharp edges cut into the sky, their bases rooted in the earth. They joined heaven and earth, mortal and divine. Inside their silent chambers, the Pharaoh's body would rest, wrapped in linen, preserved with care, surrounded by objects chosen to ease his journey. The walls glimmered with painted images, boats sailing over celestial waters, fields of grain stretching to the horizon, gods extending their hands in blessing. The pyramid was not only a tomb, but a map, a prayer, a promise of eternal renewal. At the heart of these beliefs lay the weighing of the heart. The Egyptians knew that the heart was more than flesh. It was the seat of truth, memory, conscience. In the hall of judgment, the Pharaoh would stand before Osiris. Anubis, jackal-headed, would place the heart upon the scales, balancing it against the feather of Mat. Thoth, wise and calm, would record the outcome. If the heart was light, unburdened by lies or cruelty, it would pass forward. If heavy, it would be devoured by Amit, the eater of the dead. Yet for the Pharaoh, who lived guided by ritual and order, the heart was to be made light, ready to ascend. This ceremony was not a threat, but a purification, a confirmation that the Pharaoh's reign had honored the gods and upheld balance. The night sky, dotted with stars, offered another vision of eternity. The Egyptians believed that the Pharaoh, upon passing, would join the undying stars, the imperishable ones that never set. There he would shine forever, keeping watch over his land, his people, his descendants. The shafts of pyramids aligned with these constellations, pointing the Pharaoh's spirit toward his celestial destiny. Death lifted him from earth to sky, from the dust of the desert to the brilliance of the heavens. The rituals of burial reflected the deep care with which death was regarded. The body was anointed with oils, perfumed with frankincense and myrrh, wrapped carefully in linen that carried the warmth of countless prayers. Amulets were placed between the wrappings, scarabs for rebirth, eyes for protection, ankhs for eternal life. Each layer was bound with words spoken softly, calling upon gods, guiding the spirit. The face was covered with a mask of gold, serene, radiant, a reflection of divinity. The Pharaoh, even in stillness, appeared calm, eternal, already belonging to the realm beyond. The tomb itself was a treasury of memory. Chests of clothes, vessels of wine, baskets of grain, jars of honey, jewelry of gold and stone, all were placed with care. Each object carried meaning, not wealth alone, but continuity. Food for the car, beauty for the bar, strength for the OH. Even games and musical instruments were placed within, for joy was part of eternity. The pharaoh would not enter a cold silence, but a living paradise, full of light, music, abundance, and peace. The people who served him shared in this faith. They knew that their king's passage ensured the flow of the Nile, the rising of the sun, the order of the seasons. His eternal life was bound to the life of the land itself. To mourn him was to honor the bond, but despair was softened by belief. For if the pharaoh rose as Osiris, if he sailed with Ra, then life itself was assured. The fields would flourish, the river would rise, children would grow, and Egypt would endure. In the quiet of their own homes, the people prepared for death in simpler ways. They left offerings of bread and beer for ancestors, spoke names aloud to keep souls alive, carried amulets close to their hearts. They knew that death came for all, yet also that eternity opened for all. The pharaoh's grandeur was a beacon, but the path was shared. In this shared destiny, the Egyptians found comfort. The pharaohs knew, as their priests reminded them, that to live rightly was to die rightly, and to die rightly was to live forever. This was the wisdom they carried, not in fear but in serenity. Death was not an abyss, not an end, but a horizon where earth met sky, where the Nile vanished into the sea, where the sun set to rise again. To approach that horizon was not to vanish, but to continue, transformed, eternal. And so, beneath the stars, in tombs of stone and silence, the pharaohs rested. Around them the desert stretched, endless and calm. Above them constellations circled, glowing with the promise of eternity. Within their chambers, painted walls whispered of green fields, flowing waters, golden light. Their souls moved onward, passing through the Duat, meeting the gods, joining the sun, rising with the dawn. Death was not darkness, but renewal, and the pharaohs, knowing this, carried no fear into eternity, only the calm assurance of life everlasting. The deep desert nights stretched endlessly, stars shimmering like eternal lanterns above the silent sands. To the pharaohs, each star was not merely light, but a soul, a presence, a reminder that existence did not end with death, but shifted into another form. As they gazed upward, they felt themselves already part of this greater order, each heartbeat echoing the rhythm of the cosmos. In the stillness of those nights, the pharaohs contemplated what it meant to leave behind the physical world and step into the vastness of eternity. Death was never spoken of as a void. It was described as a journey, a passage, a gentle continuation of the same rhythm that carried the Nile, that turned the seasons, that lifted the sun each morning and lowered it each night. The pharaohs saw themselves as participants in this unbroken cycle. When their bodies grew still, their spirits would not fade but would join the great current, the river of eternity that flowed beyond sight. The priests taught that the soul would pass through many gates, each one guarded, each one requiring knowledge and truth. Words of power were recited to open these gates, and these words were inscribed carefully on papyrus scrolls, tucked within the wrappings of the pharaoh's body, painted upon the tomb walls themselves. To the Egyptians, words were alive, carrying force and presence. In life they were prayers, in death they became keys. The pharaoh, armed with these sacred words, could move through the afterlife with assurance, never lost, never trapped. The journey was long, but it was not lonely. Gods walked beside the soul, some as protectors, some as judges, all as guides. Anubis, with his jackal head, watched over the body, ensuring it remained whole, ensuring the car was sustained. Isis, gentle and devoted, spread her wings to shelter. The soul, Horus, falcon-eyed, guided the pharaoh with vision clear and sharp. Osiris awaited at the end, serene upon his throne, not as a terror but as a welcoming presence, a king of kings, who himself had passed through death and risen renewed. The imagery painted upon tomb walls was vivid and soothing, designed not only to honor the gods, but to comfort the soul in its passage. Serpents curled, but they were bound by spells. Rivers of fire glowed, but the pharaoh sailed past them unharmed. Gates stood tall, but they opened at his command, for he carried the words, the truth, the offerings of a life lived in harmony. With Mat, beyond each trial lay peace, and beyond peace lay renewal. The Egyptians believed deeply in the field of reeds, the eternal paradise where the blessed dead would dwell. This paradise was not foreign or unfamiliar. It was a perfected reflection of Egypt itself. Fields of grain swayed gently in an endless breeze. Rivers flowed clear and full. Trees bore fruit in abundance. Families were reunited. Laughter returned. Work was light, joy unbroken. The pharaoh longed for this place, not as a distant dream, but as a destiny promised. To him, the afterlife was not exile, but homecoming. The treasures placed in the tomb were more than wealth. They were bridges to eternity. Boats carved of wood, ready to sail the celestial waters. Weapons, not for war, but for protection on the journey. Clothing and sandals, to clothe the car in comfort. Musical instruments, to bring joy. Even small carved servants, shabti, were placed within, ready to rise and work in the fields of reeds on behalf of the pharaoh. Each object was a prayer made solid, a blessing given shape, a companion for the endless voyage. The people, too, felt bound to this vision. In their own tombs, humble but filled with care, they placed bread and beer, small amulets, tokens of love. They spoke the names of their dead, for they believed that to speak a name was to keep a soul alive. The pharaoh's grandeur was unmatched, but the truths he followed were shared. All would face the weighing of the heart. All would long for the field of reeds. All would trust in the gods to guide them beyond death. The heart itself was guarded with special care. A scarab amulet, often placed upon the chest, was inscribed with words to silence the heart, to prevent it from testifying falsely at judgment. The Egyptians knew the heart held memory, truth, and conscience. In the hall of Mat, it would reveal all, but with the proper prayers, with purity of life, with the blessings of the gods, the heart would balance lightly against the feather. Of truth, the pharaoh, who lived as both man and divine, was expected to achieve this balance, not through perfection, but through devotion. His reign was his preparation, his justice, his offering, his wisdom, his shield. Night after night, the cycle was affirmed. The sun sank into the horizon, carried into the underworld, only to rise again, fresh and strong. The pharaohs looked to this cycle and saw themselves reflected. Just as Ra could not be defeated by darkness, so too they could not be undone by death. Their souls, like the sun, would travel through night and return with morning, eternal and unbroken. Temples echoed with chants that honored this truth. Priests sang of Osiris, of his death and his rising, of Isis who restored him, of Horus who avenged him. These myths were not distant tales, but mirrors of the pharaoh's destiny. In the death of Osiris, the pharaoh saw his own death. In the rising of Osiris, he saw his own eternal renewal. To be king was to walk in the footsteps of the gods, to live their myths, to embody their truths. The sands of Egypt held countless tombs, great and small, each one a testament to this belief. In the Valley of the Kings, chambers were carved deep into rock, painted with colors that glowed in torchlight, their ceilings speckled with stars, their walls alive with stories of the journey beyond. Each tomb whispered of the Pharaoh's passage, each object told of eternity. The silence of those chambers was not emptiness, but presence, the presence of souls moving beyond, the presence of gods guiding them forward. To walk in ancient Egypt was to walk among reminders of eternity. The pyramids rose upon the horizon, visible for miles, their shapes as certain as the sun. Obelisks pointed skyward, symbols of rays of light connecting earth to heaven. Statues stood with calm gazes, hands upon knees, eyes lifted toward eternity. Even the Nile, flowing endlessly, was a hymn to life and death, its floods and retreats echoing the soul's journey. The Pharaohs, in their wisdom, saw death not as something to hide, but as something to prepare for, to honor, to embrace with calm dignity. They lived with the knowledge that their reign would pass, that their bodies would rest, but that their names, their souls, their essence would endure. Death, to them, was not defeat. It was fulfillment, the final step in a path that led to eternity, to light, to peace. And so, as the desert winds whispered across the night, as the stars circled in their endless patterns, the pharaohs lay in their tombs, serene, eternal, at peace. Their souls traveled with the sun, their hearts balanced in truth, their names spoken in prayers. They knew death not as an end, but as a passage, a door that opened upon eternity. And in that knowledge, they rested calmly, awaiting the dawn that would never cease. The night sky above ancient Egypt was vast and unbroken, scattered with stars that shimmered like eternal guardians. To the pharaohs, these stars were not distant fires, but souls, radiant and enduring, guiding lights that reminded them of the continuity of existence. As they gazed upon the heavens, they felt the assurance that death was not a vanishing, but a transformation, a journey toward a place among the undying stars. The desert stretched endlessly beneath them, timeless and quiet. In its stillness, the pharaohs heard the voice of eternity, reminding them that their reign was but a chapter in an endless story. The sands shifted with the wind, covering old footprints, uncovering new paths, just as life covered and uncovered generations. In this rhythm, death was understood as part of the natural flow, not something feared, but something accepted with calm dignity. When the time came, the pharaoh entered his tomb not as one entering darkness, but as one stepping into a place prepared, with care and reverence. The air within was cool, the walls alive with painted stories, the ceilings a night sky scattered with constellations. Every surface whispered of eternity. Priests spoke soft prayers, their voices low and rhythmic, echoing gently in the stone chambers. Incense curled upward in fragrant trails, a bridge of scent between the worlds of the living and the dead. The body of the pharaoh lay within its wrappings, each layer bound with blessings, each amulet placed with intention. His face was covered with a mask of gold, serene, eternal, already resembling the gods. Around him were placed vessels of food and drink, chests of clothing, games, weapons, and treasures, each object chosen to ease his passage. These were not mere possessions, but tokens of life, reminders that existence continued beyond death. In this chamber, death and life embraced, inseparable, harmonious. The priests whispered the spells of protection, the words of power, the invocations of the gods. They called upon Anubis to guard the body, upon Thoth to record the truth, upon Isis to shelter the soul with her wings, upon Horus to guide the path, and upon Osiris to welcome the pharaoh into eternity. Their voices rose and fell like the Nile itself, steady, eternal, flowing from one world into another. Outside the tomb, life carried on. The Nile flowed as it always had, swelling with its floods, receding with its rhythm. Farmers sowed there. Fields, fishermen cast their nets. Children played upon the banks. The land of Egypt endured, nourished by the river, sheltered by the desert, watched over by the gods. To the people, the pharaoh's passing was not an ending, but a renewal, a promise that life would continue, that the cycle remained unbroken. The soul of the pharaoh journeyed onward, guided by the sacred words, shielded by amulets, sustained by offerings. He passed through the gates of the Duat, each one opening at his command. He met the guardians of the night, faced rivers of fire, crossed fields of shadow, and through it all he moved with calm assurance. For he carried with him truth, and truth was his greatest weapon. In the hall of Mat he stood before Osiris. Anubis placed his heart upon the scales, balancing it against the feather of truth. Thoth recorded the outcome with quiet precision. The heart was light, free of falsehood, unburdened by injustice. The scales balanced, and the pharaoh was welcomed forward. Osiris extended his hand. Isis smiled gently. Horus watched with pride. The pharaoh, now radiant, was no longer bound by the limits of the mortal world. He was transformed, eternal, a shining spirit among the imperishable stars. From that moment, he sailed with Ra upon the solar boat, traveling across the sky, descending into the night, rising again with the dawn. Each day the sun shone, each night the stars gleamed, and within those lights was the presence of the pharaoh, guiding, watching, sustaining the world he had once ruled. His people looked upward and felt his presence in the constellations, in the rising sun, in the endless rhythm of the Nile. The wisdom of the pharaohs was not hidden but shared. They taught through their monuments, through their temples, through their myths, that death was not to be feared. To live rightly, in harmony with Mat, was to prepare for eternity. To die was to join the cycle, to enter the field of reeds, to be reunited with family, to rest in abundance and peace. Death was a doorway, and beyond it lay light. The great pyramids still stood, their stones warmed by the sun, their shadows stretching across the desert. They were monuments not only to kings, but to this truth, that life and death were woven together, that eternity was as real as the earth and sky. Each pyramid, each tomb, each carved hieroglyph whispered the same message. The soul endures, the spirit shines, the journey continues. As centuries passed, the sands shifted, covering tombs, hiding chambers, burying secrets. Yet the truth, the pharaohs knew, remained, carried in myth, preserved in stone, spoken in whispers by those who remembered. Even now, their knowledge speaks across the ages, reminding us that death is not silence, not emptiness, but transformation. The pharaohs knew that to die was to rise, to pass into eternity, to join the eternal stars. And so, in the quiet of the desert night, in the endless rhythm of the Nile, in the shining constellations above, their wisdom endures. It is a wisdom that soothes, that comforts, that calms. Death is not to be feared. It is to be embraced as part of the endless cycle, as certain and gentle as the dawn that follows night, as the flood that follows drought, as the star that follows darkness. The pharaohs knew this, and in their knowing they found peace. May this peace rest with you as well. As you listen, let the calm of the desert surround you. Let the flow of the Nile carry you. Let the stars above remind you of eternity. Rest gently, knowing that life continues, that death is a passage, that eternity is always near. Close your eyes, breathe softly, and let the wisdom of the Pharaohs guide you into dreams as calm as the field of reeds, as endless as the stars, as serene as eternity itself.